Welcome to the Embodiment podcast. This show is for you if you see the body as more than a brain taxi. It's for people interested in coming home to the body as a holistic aspect of who we are and how we live. Episodes contain practical tips, exercises you can take away, and interviews with specialists from around the world. I'm your host for today, Mark Walsh. So on the show today, Deborah Jay-Levin. So Deborah is a founding member of Open Floor, which is a conscious dance movement that I like quite a lot. If you want to learn more about. She's been in the movement world for quite some time and staying at the Findhorn Community and Eco Village. And we'll say a little bit more about that later. Since 1986, it's a pretty unique place actually. So she works with groups, she works one-to-one, and she's joining us today from the Darks of Scotland. So Deborah, welcome.
Thank you, Mark. It's really good to be here.
How did you get interested in movement in the body?
Well, I always loved to move. I always loved to dance, but it never occurred to me to do it professionally in any way whatsoever. And when I was 20, I had no idea what I was doing with my life. I had applied for one university course that I found interesting and didn't get in, and had been in Israel working on a kibbutz and traveling, and came back to London, which is where I'm originally from. And I was getting a lift home from babysitting for someone who'd been my youth worker. I was very involved in the Jewish youth movement when I was growing up, and was involved, like at age 16, I was doing leadership courses as part of the youth work. So I was already involved in working with groups at that point. And he said to me, I've heard about this course I think you might be interested in, and handed me a folded up piece of white paper, which ended up being the prospectus for a course in the use of movement and drama in therapy. Which is known as the Sesame Institute. Well, it's run by the Sesame Institute, based at the Central School of Speech and Drama in London. Mm-hmm. And I looked at this and I thought, wow, you can study that? I had no idea. It sounded so fascinating. It was working with Jungian psychology, acting out myths and fairy tales with Laban movement. So that's what I ended up studying, which was a postgraduate, but I hadn't been to university. So I then spent a year getting as many suitable qualifications as I could, including working for MenCap as a family support worker with people with learning difficulties, and doing creative dance for people with learning disabilities. And it was while I was doing that course as a movement and drama therapist that I went to a shamanic New Year's event with Leo Rutherford and Nick Twilley. So this was 1987. And Leo and Nick had just come back from working in the States with Gabrielle Roth. It was before there were any 5 Rhythms teacher trainings or anything. Nick had been drumming for her and Leo had been dancing with her. Mm-hmm. And I went to this New Year's retreat and was introduced to the 5 Rhythms for the first time. Fell in love with that and did 2 more workshops with Nick, and then went and danced with Gabrielle in 1988 in London, and did my first weekend with her and was like, I want to train in this. So spoke to her about that. She said, wait another 6 months until you finish your training. We'll be doing another training then. And I ended up waiting 5 years before she did another training, and went on to study and train with Gabrielle. So that's how I actually got into movement being my primary focus. And I would say last year I had the amazing opportunity to do a TEDx talk based up here in Findhorn, and chose the theme to be restoring health and wisdom through embodied movement. And I opened up the TEDx talk by talking about having a stammer. And it was in the research for the TEDx talk that I realized that my relationship with my stammer, which I developed when I was 9 years old, by the age of 10, I couldn't string a sentence together. I got a really bad stammer, had speech therapy when I was 12. I realized that my stammer and my knowing that this physical impediment to my speech being fluent was definitely well, how can I say, a symptom of something internal. And I think without my realizing it, that was a beginning of a fascination between the mismatch between what is interior and what is exterior, and the body being the vehicle that either communicates or hides that, or attempts to hide it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's go back a bit. So we've had Fire Rhythms teachers on before,
Yeah.
various people like Adam Barley and various other people involved with Fire Rhythms. But just for those who didn't catch that episode, who was Gabrielle Roth, and briefly, what was the Fire Rhythms?
Gabrielle Roth was the founder and creator of the Five Rhythms, which she was known as an urban shaman. Developed the work in Esalen in the early 60s. At the time of Fritz Perls, who was also the founder of Gestalt. It was like a hotbed of creative intelligence in that time, and created this movement map with 5 different rhythms: flowing, staccato, chaos, lyrical, and stillness, that emerged from her spending hours watching people moving. She taught dance from a very early age. So she developed the 5 rhythms as a synthesis of whatever had informed her. And that is now a hugely successful and becoming increasingly globally known movement practice. I would imagine it's the most well-known movement practice in the world.
Well, one of the world's conscious dance practices.
In terms of conscious dance practices, that's what I was about to add on. Yeah.
And there's been all these offshoots, right? Like we had Yakov from Movement Medicine, who I rate very highly, and I spoke to earlier today, actually. He's a friend of mine. And there's been, various other offshoots of that. And one of the most sort of recent ones that I've become interested in myself personally is this open floor movement. Mm-hmm. So could you say a little bit about that as one of the kind of early members?
Sure. Open Floor International was founded about a year or so after Gabrielle Roth died by 15 senior 5 rhythm teachers. So, as I think is quite common, when a founder dies, there is often a dissolution and a chaos and a time of falling apart. Yes. As people re-find their place and as things reorganize and shift. So Andrea, Johan, Kathy Altman, and Laurie Saltzman and Vic Cooper are the 4 founders of Open Floor International. And together with a group of us, we created the organization, which is hugely informed by our 5 rhythms background and knowledge, and a ton of other influences from the shamanic, artistic, therapeutic, mindfulness. It's a rich tapestry of influences. I think 2 of the things that for me really stand out in the work, which I really love, is the fact that we've chosen to use a governance process called sociocracy or dynamic governance, if you know of that, which I introduced because it's a model I'm familiar with from the community where I live. That's how my car club is governed. So I was introduced to dynamic governance here in Findhorn. So that's the decision-making process that we use, which is a very collaborative and, there is hierarchy because you need to have lines of authority in order to get things done. I think that's quite a basic statement, but I think that's true. And within that, the way that policy decisions get made is within a very collaborative equivalence way of being, where everybody's voice is actually equal.
Yes, I think there's 2 mistakes, isn't there? There's on the one mistake is having too hierarchical of an organization where there isn't any listening and there isn't any creativity and there isn't any democracy, which is a core value of Western civilization. And then the other mistake is the sort of hippie circle of everyone gets an opinion, everyone's equal, even though some people have been doing it 30 years and some 30 minutes. That doesn't make sense to have no competence hierarchies and the confusion of competence hierarchies with dominance hierarchies.
Yeah, exactly. So there's the way of how do we actually make decisions where everybody's voice is heard, but not spend hours and hours going around in circles and processing and not actually being effective and actually seeing our visions manifest in the world. So that is, I find sociocracy an incredibly valuable tool. And I am quite sure that at this stage, it's one of the reasons why Open Floor is actually doing as well as it is.
Well, I want to focus on a couple of things you said here, because I think because people listen to this from all different backgrounds. And I want to talk about Open Floor, the practice, and hear you talk about that. But there's a couple of things there. One is the sort of founder death syndrome, which I've seen in Aikido. And I've seen in other areas, other disciplines, where there's been a charismatic founder and everyone has loved them and they've loved both the practice and their personality. And normally they sort of get mixed in a little bit, which is dangerous in other ways. And then when they die, classically in Japanese martial arts, there's always a split between the inheriting family and the senior students. And I've seen this in other arts as well. There's a sort of monastic tradition of sort of father, son, daughter, whatever, based on genetic heritage, essentially. And then there's the sort of senior students. You may actually be senior to that person or just better than that person. And this is in the martial arts I'm talking about, where I've seen it. And then there's often a conflict there at that point, because students go, well, do we follow the family lineage, or do we follow, it's sort of Republican meritocracy versus monarchy, really? Or do we follow, and there may be good reasons to follow a sort of established lineage, or do at this point when the founder dies. That's normally the breaking off period. In Japanese martial arts, they normally do it a year later. There's a sort of year of mourning, and then it happens, nearly always, actually. And I've seen this several times in different Japanese organizations, and it's slightly amusing to me that it's been replicated in America and the West, this sort of similar problem, really.
Yeah. I mean, I think it is a similar problem. And when it comes from, it has a sense of tradition in it. Like you say, there's a year of mourning. I think that can really help that transition be less traumatic.
Yes.
And I would say that's one of the reasons why what happened after Gabrielle died was very confusing and painful for many people, was because there was such an impetus or impulse or need to move on and know, well, what happens now?
Yes.
That there wasn't that time for mourning. And so then that ripples on and has an effect anyway, because grieving needs its place one way or another. It will have its say.
Yes.
So
yes, the idea of sort of having a succession plan is common in certain areas of embodiment, but not in others. And I think particularly in America, where people think they're going to live forever, and succession is generally sort of almost a taboo to talk about what happens when the founder dies, even when they're 80. I've seen organizations in denial of this. It's like, come on, they're 80. They might have another 10 years if we're lucky, and no one wants them to pass away. So no one really wants to talk about a succession plan and what, that being discussed as a thing. Whereas there are other traditions where there's very clear norms, boundaries, traditions around succession. So I find that as the baby boomers die off, who are the main instigators of modern embodiment, I see this is becoming increasingly an issue. This is why I bring it up, because I think it's aside from just the sort of Five Rhythms open floor thing, it really goes across many areas. Because my own teacher is certainly elderly now and has Parkinson's, and he's kind of talking about what he wants done with his websites after he dies. There's some very practical conversations there. So I just feel like we're in denial about this.
Are so important, because part of what you're talking about actually is in not having a succession plan, or a succession plan that's been agreed upon, is actually, how do we talk about death?
Yes.
And the fact that is such a taboo subject means that the very practical details, as well as all of the emotional aspects of that, get left and don't get talked about. And then the people who are left behind are the people who end up having to pick up the pieces. And sometimes that's messier and more painful than it might need to be if that forethought had been put in ahead of time. And I think I want to be clear that I'm not saying that there wasn't forethought put in. I think my impression is that Gabrielle was actually incredibly clear that what her offering and what she was handing on was a family lineage. And exactly as you said, there was a discrepancy between the family lineage and some of the elders and the senior teachers. And ultimately, it's also to do with trust, actually.
Yes.
Where does the trust actually get?
Well, it's also against the major traditions of Western civilization. Like family lineages are something we've kind of gotten rid of, for better and for worse, in this tradition. Whereas in Japan, it's just assumed that I just met the great grandson of the founder of Aikido in Tokyo, who was on the mat, and he's a child, and he's being groomed for that job. That's normal there. Whereas in our civilization, it's not really the norm. We don't expect the CEO's son to be the head of the company after the CEO. That would be considered strange and weirdly monastic, because we had a kind of renaissance and the idea of meritocracy and the idea of experience trumping genetics. And like we kind of,
It's nepotism as well.
Yes, it seems like nepotism to people who think differently. And again, I just want to say there are definite benefits to the sort of Eastern way and the family system, but I would really claim it doesn't fit with our culture well, because we would see it as nepotism rather than a kind of tradition that's there. And as I said, I don't know about the specifics of this case, but I've certainly seen this in other lineages, other arts, and I think it's well worth discussing, because we're increasingly going to have these conversations in the next 10 years as the founders of many arts do die.
Exactly, because you've got many people who are in their 70s, 80s and 90s even, who really help land new traditions and ways of being, and they are dying off. That's
as a land generation, like they're really elderly now, the sort of 60s generation. And the other thing that comes up for me here is like the models we have of talking about sociocracy. I've been currently starting these embodiment circles with a group of people from around the world.
I noticed that, and I was curious about how's that going to operate?
Well, it's fascinating because it's open source. It's based on the 12-step model, which is traditions but not authority figures. And no command and control, and it's I'm helping start it with a group of people, but it's not owned by anyone. It's not a business. There's no copyrights. There's no, and I know this is very different from the Fire Rhythms tradition. I've seen it. There's a very set, this is the Fire Rhythms trademark and brand, and people will send legal letters if people use that against people's. Well, I'm going to be just blunt here. I've had some unpleasant experiences with this. And and I've seen other people who have, and it's not how I want to. It's not the world I want to live in, and it's very different from, say, contact improvisation, where they made a very conscious choice not to go down that road. And I wonder which is more in the spirit of the times. Is it the sort of brand, command, control, and sue people who step out of line, or is it the open source, empower people to do things in their own way?
I mean, I'm clear about where I come from, and a lot of that is also because I have spent a significant amount of the last 30 years living in community. It's like community is my norm.
Yeah.
And collaboration and cooperation, which, oh my God, has its downside absolutely in learning to deal with all of the group dynamics that come along with that. And it's one of the other, when I said the two things I'm particularly proud of really around Open Floor International decisions that got made, one of which was the decision to use sociocracy. The other is to be licensed with the Creative Commons license. So we are open source.
Can you say what that is for listeners? Because the sort of Creative Commons and open source may or may not be familiar.
Absolutely. Well, the Creative Commons license, there are different licenses that you can actually choose, but it's a way of working with open source material. We've chosen the Creative Commons license. I think it's 4.0, which basically means if you were to come to an open floor workshop with me, then you would be free to use the material that I have given in that workshop, as long as you attribute where you got it from, i.e. it came from my workshop, and you share it in the same vein, which means if I've just passed this information on to you, you are not then allowed to go and charge for it.
Yes.
If you pass it on. So it has to be in the same spirit it's been received as. And it doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. There is this need for attribution, I think, really is really important in terms of honouring lineage and actually where we come from and what comes towards us. But it also is like, take this material and make the world a better place. Yes. And it just has this completely different feeling of generosity.
It's totally different, isn't it? It's totally different mindset, body set. It's totally different. I don't want to spend my time running after people as a policeman. Equally, it pisses me off when I see things on the internet that I know I created. And, I hear back from my students that someone was teaching one of the forms I created.
Right.
And I go, just mention where it comes from. Like on my handouts for the Embodied Facilitator course, it says influenced by Paul Linden, Richard Strezzi Heckler, Wendy Barmer, Stuart Heller, all the people that's influenced me. And it's still written on that handout.
Right.
That's there.
Yeah,
so
I mean, that's like that. Basic respect, really, And of course, sometimes I might be teaching an exercise and I go, this exercise was introduced to Open Floor through Andrea Yuhan. It's an exercise from Gestalt awareness practice. I honor her. I hope that the people, if anyone knows how to use it, because that's the other thing, it's not for anyone to just pick up these exercises or scores that we're doing and just kind of go out there and pass them on, because it also takes years of training and expertise, as you know yourself.
Yes.
This work goes deep and opens up places inside on all sorts of levels. So it's also about trusting people.
There's this line, isn't there, between kind of helping people realize they need to be responsible with it, but without trying to control people. And there's something about that mindset of sort of scarcity mindset of like, I have to control. It's like, where's your faith in your own ability as well? When people have that mindset of trying to control the world, of suing people, of going after people. It's like, do you really want to live in that embodied emotional mental world? Like, it just strikes me as unpleasant to live in that world, to be so scared that you have to go after people all the time.
It depends partly on, I mean, when I listen to you, it makes me think about, well, how much fear is there in the system? Because that's what governs that, and that need to, and what is the difference between control and protecting integrity? Those can be fine lines, and where is it coming from my ego and my sense of entitlement, and where is it something that's connected to my soul? For example, when people
business needs, sorry to interrupt, there's also just a business, like a lot of the Americans particularly put a copyright on things because it's their business, and they think of it as a primarily they're protecting their business aims.
Yeah, and then it's like, well, which part of the business is mine is even a question that I then get curious about. Like, if I create a playlist and someone comes up to me at the end of a workshop or at the end of a class and says, I love your playlist, would you give me your playlist, please? I'm like, well, it's like, it's not just 15 tracks of music. That's 30 years and more of listening to music, of knowing how to create and sculpture and adjust. And if I just give you that music, I'm actually giving you something so intimate, and I'm not sure that's always appreciated.
Yes, and hugely valuable. And actually, it's interesting. I have this conversation in my head at the moment between what's universal and can't be copyrighted and what's form and can. So, for example, there's a type of centering I created called ABC centering, and it's very set, names for each thing. And then I've seen some other companies using this now, and I'm pissed because that's a set form that I created.
Freeze again.
Exact same words. Like, where's the line between something universal with the body that can't be copyrighted, and where's the line of a form that can? So an example of this is like something centering, state regulation techniques, that's universal. But specific forms, like, I don't know, I invented one called ABC. It seems to me like that is specific to someone who created it. And, recently there's a case in the US media about dances being copyrighted or not. There's a computer game that's used the dances of famous rappers and put those dances on computer characters. And people are asking, well, can those dance moves be copyrighted? Do the rappers who've invented these dance moves, are they able to sue this computer games company that's made millions?
Right.
And it's like, what can you copyright? Like, can you copyright movements? Can you copyright, the rhythms? If that's a universal structure of nature, can you copyright that?
Right. Well, there's two places I go when I listen to that. One is, are you familiar with the YouTube videos, Everything is a Remix?
And is that where they show that different songs come from other songs?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
Really, I love watching those, and I just find it just blows apart the part of my brain that gets kind of attached to ownership.
Yes, because everything is influenced by something else, right?
Yes, it's like, how on earth can I define what belongs where and what belongs to? And at the same time, when I'm designing a workshop and I design a new score that I get really excited about, and I'm like, I want that to be honored. I want that to have respect. And then it comes back to attribution, actually. Then it comes back to crediting and attribution.
Yeah, I've had yoga teacher friends who had just had their websites copy pasted, and they found the exact same copy paste on other yoga websites without the attribution. And
and I had 2 people who were redoing their website last year actually contact me and say, we're redoing our website and we really like your website. Would you be okay if we kind of work off some of what you've done? And I had this moment of like, well, on the one hand, yes. And on the other hand, my God, that cost me a fortune.
Yeah.
When, it's like, how do I respond to this? And in the end, I said yes. And I would also like, if I ever see anything on yours, then I'm going to contact you. And it's like, there's a sense of, I want there to be a flow, and I also need to be open to be challenged around it.
Yes. I'd love to hear a little bit more about open floor as a practice. Could you say a little bit about what it involves?
Sure. Open floor movement practice is a resource-based movement practice. I heard Andre Yuhan describe it like that, and I really like that. So we work with core movement resources, which you can find in any embodied movement practice, but it's the way. So there's nothing original about them. They are universal, but the way that we've broken them down is like essential life skills. So I need to know about being grounded, and it's helpful for me to also be able to recognize in my body what it's like when I don't feel grounded and when I'm not in my sense of substance. So ground, for example, is a resource. Pause is a resource to really learn how to value those moments of pausing, to appreciate them, to validate them, to pause physically, to be able to pause the momentum of the mind, which is what my meditation practice is about. There's nothing new, as I said, about them. So we've got 10 core movement resources that we work with. And we work with what we call a 4x4 web. So there's 4 dimensions of embodiment and 4 relational hungers that are weaving together and interspersing and varying what's more in the foreground and what's more in the background. So the 4 dimensions of embodiment are physical, the body, emotional embodiment, and embodiment of the mind, cognitive embodiment of like stories, imagination, all those thoughts that get trapped inside, driving us crazy. It's like, well, what's the movement of those stories, of the mind, of all that intelligence that lives in the mind and the brain, the mind and the gut, the heart mind. There's so much judgment around the mind and so much, marginalization of the stories that we create as if they're wrong. And actually there's a vast, huge creativity that shows up on the dance floor when we take those stories, when we take that intelligence of the mind and actually include it onto the dance floor. So we've got physical embodiment, emotional embodiment, embodiment of the mind, and then embodiment of the soul. And that can mean different things for different people. In the open floor perspective, it's really about my soul being the part of me that is unique, is beyond ego, is beyond personality, but it is a sense of essence where if you and I were to do exactly the same movement, it would still enter into the space and be experienced as different because of an essence in you or me that is different, that I believe is connected to our soul. So we've got those 4 dimensions of embodiment. And then we have what we call the 4 relational hungers, in that it is part of human nature to be in relationship. That doesn't mean it's necessarily a pleasant experience all of the time, but there's the hunger for solitude, there's the hunger for connection, the hunger for belonging, and the hunger for spirit. And I'm happy to go into those in more depth. But what we do when I'm teaching is different workshops, and this is true for all open floor teachers, different classes, different workshops will have different hungers in the foreground or a different dimension of embodiment in the foreground. It's all always there. It's like one of our core values is move and include. There is no amputation. There is no separation of I'm dancing, but my feelings are over there. It is all welcome on the dance floor. And at the same time, there is a studying and a learning around, well, what's the focus right now and what is needed in the room? What's the primary teaching that's needed here to help this group of people become as embodied and expressive as they possibly can be and connected to their vitality? So that's what I'm always looking at as an open floor teacher. And what I'm leaning into is this 4x4 web. I'm leaning into the core movement resources, and I'm moving into our underneath movement cycle. So there's a movement cycle that is there all the time. The movement cycle is open attention, enter, explore, and then at the end of it, we finish with a settling. Those are the 4 stages.
I'm just trying to picture this. I've only been in a few open floor kind of influence type classes, or there's one teacher here in Brighton. Right. And it seemed to me almost like a reinvention of dance movement therapy, but with a slightly spiritual bent. It also seemed to me that it was a little bit more workshoppy or exercisey than fire rhythms. And generally fire rhythms classes, not always, I know, and certainly not in workshops, but generally I experience them as you go, the teacher plays music, you go through body parts, you do a wave, and there might be a period where you take partners perhaps, that's offered as a witnessing, but generally it's a sort of just the flow through an experience where the little bit of open floor I saw and have been part of, it seemed to be more like, okay, we're going to explore this particular thing through an exercise now, rather than just a sort of simply an embodied process. Did I get the right impression or not at all?
Well, I think that is a familiar impression, but for me, that distinction is not necessarily from one movement practice to another, but it's also very much to do with teachers.
Sure.
And how different people have their different teaching style, because I know I love teaching, and on a Sunday evening in Findhorn, I hold a Sweat Your Prayers, which is a 5 rhythms practice space where I don't teach. But if I was teaching a 5 rhythms class or a 5 rhythms workshop, I'm not actually teaching any more 5 rhythms workshops, but I do still occasionally teach classes, and I still do Sweat Your Prayers. If I was teaching a class, I would teach. And I think the teaching is so important to help actually people move out of their frozen movement patterns.
Yep.
So I do think that as I've been teaching open floor now for about 4 years, I see that in the beginning, I think I didn't quite have the balance right between the amount of time talking and exercising and the amount of time given to free movement, where the movement was just there to really integrate and move through whatever needed to be moved through without any information being input in.
How's it been now? About 10 years or something? It's been a few years, hasn't it, that open floor's been around? 8 years?
No, I mean, Gabrielle only died 6 years ago.
6 years ago. Okay, I somehow remembered it as being a little bit longer. But
he died in October 2012. So I taught my first open floor workshop in September 2014.
And maybe in the early days, people were keen to sort of break out of the constraints they'd been in and do different things. And
I think I certainly felt pressure to be able to explain and demonstrate how what I'm doing now is different from what I was doing before. Yes. And I don't feel that pressure anymore, because the more I teach open floor, the more different it feels from teaching 5 rhythms. And I know we are talking a lot about 5 rhythms and open floor, and I have been teachers of both. So, and I also notice a discomfort in me about not wanting to just polarize between those two. I think in terms of what you were saying is I do think open floor has a more, how can I say, therapeutic influence.
Yes.
I mean, Andrea is one of the founders, and she also created 5 rhythms for therapists. I can't actually remember what it was called right now, but with Gabrielle's kind of agreement, she worked out a program for people who were therapists to use 5 rhythms. It was like a year-long trial of that, and I don't have my facts right about that, just so you know.
Okay.
And Andrea is a Gestalt psychotherapist. That influence is definitely there. We've developed a whole therapy in motion program, which is a really exciting part of the teacher training program, that you can train to be a movement teacher, and you can also be a therapist and learn how to bring embodied movement more into your therapeutic practice. And so that is there. And I think we're still a young organization, to be completely honest. And I think that finding the balance between induction and instruction is something that takes time. And it's something in my own classes that even after all these years of teaching, I'm still, the last few workshops that I taught this autumn, I was still experimenting with, okay, the reality is that most people coming onto the dance floor are so full. They are just so full of what is going on in their lives and around them and on the planet, especially at the beginning. They don't have room for a lot more information to come in. So I need to really help them empty out and use the resources to help them empty out, become more centered, become more grounded, become more spacious inside and with their relationship with the room around them. And then once that's happened, then maybe go on a journey together and new information can come in. But it's a never-ending process, and that's one of the reasons why I'm still doing it after so many years.
Yes, there's something for instruction, isn't there? I think it was about a year of going to a 5 rhythms class before I actually realized what the practice was. You know, like in inverted commas, what I was supposed to be doing, because there is a practice. It's not just a free-for-all.
Exactly. And that's why I've always been known. I had people come to my classes for years, and at the end of it go, oh my God, those are actually the 5 rhythms. I didn't know.
I've also seen Sophia in Lewis. You know, I've seen her stop a 5 rhythms wave halfway through and just go, guys, this is the rhythm, you know, like, and actually teach a little bit. And actually, even though part of me found it difficult, another part of me was like, actually, this is tremendously helpful right now. But, you know, as you say, I'm often coming to dance just full of my head full of ideas, a bit tired. I need half an hour just rolling around on the floor, connecting to the ground, breathing, feeling before I'm in any state to do some sort of partner exercise about my relationship to belonging, you know?
Right. And it is a real art to know, how do I bring these people from being isolated individuals who showed up on a dance floor, bringing everything with them consciously or unconsciously that's going on in their life and in the world around them. How do I help these people come into themselves and have some sense of interconnection, so that by the time they leave in a much more whole sense of self and feel spacious and not feel overloaded. And I think that takes a lot of skill to be able to do that, to be honest. And that skill is done with music, and it is done, it's done with guidance, and there's a difference between guidance and also exercises. I mean, I love structure. I love to be taught. I know that for some people, they end up in a class or a workshop where there's an exercise and they're being taught, and they feel like they're back in primary school being told what to do, how to do it.
In conscious dance, I'm going to jump in, particularly in conscious dance, there's just that sort of slightly teenage, no one tells me what to do thing going on. I mean, to be honest, I think the whole scene needs to grow the fuck up in terms of relationship to structure and authority.
And I find that really sad, because I think people are missing out. People are really missing out on a richness of movement vocabulary that then translates through all the other levels if they're only coming to just have a fabulous dance. Now, believe me, I love having a fabulous dance. But I think if you're not willing to allow someone with years of skill or who's gone through a training to pass on to you something that their only intention is to help you become a better person. I mean, I think anyone I've ever met in that role has had that intention to one degree or another. Then I do think it's sad that there's so much reactiveness around that. It pisses me off, to be honest.
Is there I think there perhaps is a tension between feeling good and education, because there's two kind of goals that are being aimed at in any conscious dance class. On the one hand, there's wisdom. There's, you know, we want to learn about ourselves. We're there to look at our patterns. We're there to explore ourselves. And that almost by definition is not comfortable. And then there's also, I just want to have a good time. I want to feel good. I want to have that nice buzz that you get after 2 hours of dancing and being in the body. You know, I used to take drugs. It's almost as good, you know? And I kind of go, maybe a bit better. Like, is there a tension between feeling good and education? And I know that it's an easy answer to say no, there isn't, but I'm not sure if I believe that anymore.
Oh, I think there is a tension between that. I mean, I even see that in my own life. I mean, it's like in Sweat Your Prayers, Gabrielle's second book, I was in the acknowledgements for my ferocious introspection. It's like I am an introvert and I do love to look within. And I have to challenge myself to go, Deborah, put down being the inner work junkie and go out and just have fun. Yes. That I have to look for that in terms of in my own life. If I look for that in my own life, I probably have to keep an eye on that in my own teaching as well, seeing as we tend to teach best what we need to learn the most. And
the opposite is also, I think the opposite pathology is more common though, which is people having a good time rather than learning. Do you see what I mean? So I think your pathology is a little bit less common actually.
Yes, that's probably why I've experienced quite a lot of loneliness in my life. It's like, well, who are the people like me who just have this hunger? And that's why I ended up in a spiritual community at age 20.
Let's talk about Findhorn. So very briefly, because unfortunately time is ticking. What is Findhorn for those of us who are not out there?
Well, for those of you who are not up here in the northeast of Scotland, which is where I am, what I will say first of all is that when people hear the word Findhorn, they often think one thing in terms of they might have heard of this New Age spiritual community. It was the first New Age community established in 1962, as far as I know, the longest running. Actually, Findhorn can be broken down into, there is an old Scottish fishing village of Findhorn, which is actually where I live in an 18th century stone cottage that is completely nothing to do with the Findhorn Foundation. Yep. Which is an educational trust or charity that was actually founded in 1972, that it was set up as a charity. So the Findhorn Foundation, you could say, is more like the ashram or the university that has a year-long program of courses from 1 week to 3 months to people becoming students here, learning about everything from permaculture to angels to healing with crystals to dance workshops to interpersonal dynamics to animal communication. So there's tons of programs that the Findhorn Foundation offers, and there are many different ways to be part of that. Then there's the Findhorn community. The Findhorn community is like, I'm a signed up paying member with a subscription to the Findhorn community, which is a bit like the village that is around the university. So I live here. I'm part of the Findhorn community. I have my own home. Have my own business, and I teach for the Findhorn Foundation once a year. I use the meditation sanctuaries when I want to. I hire facilities off the Findhorn Foundation when I teach my classes and workshops. I benefit from the beautiful transformational work that the Findhorn Foundation is really is dedicated to being a living demonstration of.
Okay.
And then there's also people, you could say that 50 kilometers wide, there are people who might not have chosen to live in this remote part of the northeast of Scotland, if the Findhorn Foundation and community weren't here. But they don't pay a yearly subscription to our community association. They come and go however they want to, and that's their choice to do that. So there's many different ways of being involved.
Okay, so I've heard very mixed reports. Several of my friends have said I should never go. I'd hate it. It's so New Age. I'll be told about angels and crystals. And other people have said, you know what? It's basically a really pleasant, friendly, sort of like a cult, but not mean. Not nasty, sort of a very pleasant, community. I've known people who have lived there, who are very nice people. And it just certainly does seem unique in the UK, at least.
Yeah, I think it is quite unique in the UK and in Europe, actually. I mean, it's not as unique as it was because there are so many different centres now all over the world, which is fantastic. But in terms of, in response to what you just said, yes, you would come here and you would find some people who talk about angels and being able to see plant spirits. and who've done drawings of plant spirits. I've never seen a plant spirit. I've never seen an angel, as far as I know. I do believe in the unseen beings and in the unseen worlds, and that I am not alone in this universe, and that there is a benevolent force that, when I remember, is around me and supports me, and that I can lean into. To me, there's nothing airy-fairy about that. It's actually very matter-of-fact. Are there quite a lot of people here who drive me up the wall and who I consider to be quite flaky? Yes. Do I meet those people all over the world? Yes. Is there a higher proportion of them here? Probably, yes. Are there people who are like running their businesses, bringing up their children, having to chop wood, carry water here? Absolutely. I think one of the things I love about this place is that there is a commitment to trying to do things differently. So everything that happens elsewhere in the world happens here, but there is a commitment to clean up after ourselves as best as we can, and to take care of our relationships with each other and the planet as much as possible. And I appreciate living in an environment that has that heightened awareness. That really works for me.
Yes, I mean, certainly there's a lot to be said for even just the intention to say, you know what, be a little bit more about how we communicate, how we treat the environment, how we work. And often these utopian communities, do go horribly wrong, or at least a little bit off. But there is that positive intention there at the heart of it that I think is really worth acknowledging.
Thank you. Well, listen, I have a spare room, and I think my house would be fairly safe.
Should visit.
And
dolphins going to sneak in, or unicorns, or I've also had some really good things, Deborah. So I actually feel relaxed enough to tell you the both sides that I've heard. But I've had some friends that have taught there and had a great time. And maybe my mum actually went there years ago and had a great time. Maybe it's time I popped up and did one of the many courses.
You've got to actually make a decision for yourself and find out. I think your discerning capabilities are probably
long way away, though, Deborah. This is a long way. I could get to New York quicker than Findhorn.
Where do you live?
I live in Brighton.
Brighton, easy. You can just fly direct from Gatwick to Inverness, probably 5 hours door to door, or you can spend a very beautiful 8 or 9 hours on the train.
The train's quite pleasant, actually. I quite like it.
Beautiful. I often do it by train.
The train is nice, isn't it? That train that goes north from London, it's quite a pleasant journey.
I love that train journey.
Look at us talking about trains, talking about the weather earlier before we started. Could it get more British? Okay, so this is good. What might surprise people about Findhorn, do you think? What might be, because people might now have an image in their head of sort of hippie courses and workshops. What might be really surprising to people?
Well, people might be surprised by all the new building that has happened over the last 20 years. There's a lot of new building that has been done with environmental principles, and I think some people would be surprised by how much new building has happened, and some people might be surprised by there's a few houses that are really big, and then there's all sorts of flats and affordable accommodation options and stuff. That might surprise people. I mean, it is slowly turning from being a caravan park, which is what it originally was, into being a real village, which was part of the original guidance that one of the founders of the Findhorn Foundation really saw, that this would become a city of light.
Yes.
And it's well on its way to being a village, so that might
live there?
Surprise people. What was that?
How many people live there?
Well, over the 50-kilometre range that I was talking about, there's probably 500 people here in the vicinity. I think the actual Findhorn Foundation has about 100 co-workers. And I think in our community telephone list, there's about 400 names, but not all of those people live here, but they are members of the community who want to be in the telephone list, who have a long-standing relationship with the place. So people might be surprised by our windmills, by our alternative sewage treatment. They might be surprised by the stunning Universal Hall Art Centre, which is where I get to teach, which took 10 years to build in the 1970s. Wow. And the beauty of the landscape. I mean, it is stunning here. It is absolutely stunning.
Scotland is always amazing, isn't it? And there's parts of it particularly. And living somewhere like Brighton, I know we have a lot of listeners in San Francisco and in Boulder and Byron Bay and Berlin, these kind of hubs, that it can feel like living like in a community in those. Do you know what I mean? It's like there's 2,000 yoga teachers in Brighton, for example, according to the census. So it can feel like everyone's a yoga teacher and a coach and being around that. But it's not 100% like that. Okay. Two things. First of all, where can people find out more about you and your work?
People can find out more about me by going to my website, vitalmoves.co.uk. And on there, you'll find out about the workshops that I teach in many different parts of the world. And you'll also find out about my one-to-one work, because I do a lot of work individually with people, working online and in person. And I also do this 5-day Just Me retreat that I've created, which is a real immersion through the body. So you can find out about all of that from going to my website. I have a Vital Moves Facebook page that I tend to post great music and dance videos on there. I don't do a lot of promotion on there. And I have a newsletter that I send out. And so you can also come onto my mailing list. And I've been told that people love to sit down with a cup of tea and read my newsletters. I love to write.
Okay, vitalmoves.co.uk. Nice website, actually. I've been looking at it. Well, nicely put together. So worth a look.
It's just been redone, actually. It just went
nicely done. Whoever did that, good job, Mr. or Mrs. Web Designer. Okay, and a final message about the body to close.
Oh, final message about the body. Have respect. Have respect and take your time. It's intricate and deserves listening to. Even when that might mean that you need to make a different choice than the choice that you thought you were going to make. Yeah.
Deborah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for inviting me, Mark.
Subscribe to get more. And you can also leave us a review on iTunes, which helps with our rankings. So really appreciate that. Equally, if you want to support the podcast even more, then fund us. Go to Patreon. Give us $1 per episode. Those who don't know, Patreon's a really good way of supporting things you want to see more of in the world. I know so much is available for free now. And, what I'd say is a lot of energy and effort goes into this podcast. I put it out there for free so everyone can get it. More than I work on this. Everyone that wants it can have it for free. And if you want to support us, it is really appreciated. So it's patreon.com/Mark Walsh. And of course, if you want any in-person training, you can visit embodiedfacilitator.com. There's loads more resources there too.
Till next time, welcome home to the body.